Welcome to today's Explainer. All right, we are stepping right into the classroom of history today. For all you undergrads and history buffs joining us, we'll be using the foundational text Architects of Postwar Order to really examine the whole idea of the American dream. We're zeroing in on the years between 1944 and 1952. Now, we often picture this era as just this idyllic time, right? Gleaming cars, happy families. But as we dig into these sources together, we're going to discover the deeply complex social, economic, and cultural realities that were actually hiding just beneath the surface of all that prosperity.
Okay, here is our course syllabus for today. We'll be looking at the economics of the GI Bill, Levittown and suburban shifts, the television revolution, and finally, paranoia and the Red Scare. Let's get right into it.
Module 1. Economics of the GI Bill, the financial foundation of a new era.
So let's start by defining the GI Bill of Rights, which was signed into law in 1944. When we talk about the architecture of the post-war order, this is absolutely the cornerstone. With millions of service members returning home, the government was desperate to avoid the kind of economic struggles that hit after World War I. So their solution? The GI Bill. It essentially served as this massive, totally unprecedented launchpad, literally rocketing American citizens straight into the middle class.
This bill basically operated on two main fronts: education and housing. Suddenly, you had a whole generation of young men who honestly might have only ever worked in factories or on farms, and now they had the financial backing to go to college. It created a highly educated workforce almost overnight. Simultaneously, the government practically turned into the biggest real estate agent in history. The Veterans Administration started offering incredibly generous, low-interest home loans. A returning veteran could secure a house with almost no money down. That completely restructured the entire American housing market.
And naturally, all this economic security provided by the GI Bill directly triggered something you've definitely heard of: the baby boom. We define this as a massive demographic bulge, a real explosion that would shape the U.S. economy for decades. Think about it. Couples who had put off marriage and kids during the Great Depression and the war, they finally felt secure. They had degrees, they had guaranteed mortgages, and so they started having families at a rate literally never seen before in American history.
Moving on to Module 2, Levittown and Suburban Shifts, the physical manifestation of post-war economy.
In 1947, developments like Levittown in New York became the absolute blueprint for the modern suburb. Developers like William Levitt did something brilliant. They applied wartime mass production techniques to domestic home building. They used the exact same assembly line efficiency that was just used to build airplanes and tanks. Workers would just move from lot to lot, doing one specific job over and over. And the result? Thousands of uniform, highly affordable houses seemingly sprouting up out of nowhere almost overnight. It fundamentally changed the American geographical landscape.
But, as we dig deeper into our sources, a pretty stark contrast emerges. While the suburbs offered this new utopia with neat little lawns and modern appliances, the reality was that this specific American dream was largely restricted. Through exclusionary covenants and racist lending practices, these brand new developments were heavily reserved for white middle-class families. And this triggered what's known as white flight. As white residents and their tax dollars left for the suburbs, minority communities were left behind in urban centers. They faced declining resources and systematic exclusion from this massive wealth-building opportunity.
Now, simultaneously, as those suburbs boomed, cities were undergoing their own radical transformations. The Great Migration of African Americans was still in full swing, with millions moving from the rural South to the industrial North and West looking for jobs. Plus, major Latino migrations were reshaping the cultural landscape. You had Puerto Rican citizens arriving heavily in New York City, and Mexican workers, who were originally part of the Bracero agricultural program, putting down roots in the American Southwest. So these groups fundamentally enriched the cultural fabric of American cities, but, and this is key, they were doing so while battling persistent, widespread discrimination in both housing and employment.
All right, Module 3, the television revolution, the cultural shift inside the suburb. The scale of television adoption during this era is, it's nothing short of explosive. Get this. We are looking at a jump from just 8,000 television sets in U.S. homes in 1945 to an astonishing 15 million by 1952. In just 7 years, a luxury novelty item literally became an absolute household staple.
Really think about what that does to a society. This glowing box rapidly replaced older forms of entertainment. People stopped going out as much. They just socialized right in their living rooms around the TV. But more importantly, television fundamentally homogenized American culture. For the very first time, a family in Levittown, New York, and a family in Los Angeles were watching the exact same programs, seeing the exact same advertisements, and aspiring to the exact same consumer habits. It created a unified, coast-to-coast mass-market consumer culture that heavily promoted that idealized suburban American dream.
Which brings us to Module 4, Paranoia and the Red Scare, the psychological shadow over prosperity.
I want you to consider a question for me as we look at the late 1940s and early 50s. How does the abstract terror of a global, nuclear Cold War actually manifest in the daily lives of average citizens? Like, how does global tension change the way you look at your neighbor across the street?
Well, the answer is a pervasive domestic Red Scare. And this wasn't just imaginary paranoia, right? It was fueled by a mixture of terrifying real-world events. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, and China underwent a communist revolution. So suddenly, America wasn't the sole nuclear superpower anymore. Combine that with very real, high-profile espionage cases at home, like Alger Hiss, a senior State Department official being accused of espionage, and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg actually being tried and executed for passing atomic secrets. The American public was genuinely terrified that internal subversion was happening right in their own backyards. This whole environment was basically a powder keg, and figures like Senator Joseph McCarthy were the ones holding the match. He weaponized these legitimate international fears into a massive domestic crusade. In his 1950 campaign, he famously claimed to hold a list of communists working within the U.S. government. And even though he produced very little evidence, he absolutely succeeded in creating what was described as, quote, 5 years of fear and suspicion, a climate of political conformity. Having a differing political opinion could literally get you labeled a traitor, so fear kept most people completely silent. The government's hunt for subversion reached way beyond the halls of Washington, D.C. The House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC, systematically targeted American cultural institutions. They famously went after the entertainment and film industry, resulting in the Hollywood 10, writers and directors who were sent to prison and blacklisted from working just for refusing to testify about their political beliefs. They purged accused communists from labor unions, and, perhaps most chillingly for local communities, they mandated loyalty oaths for public school teachers. Think about that for a second. The paranoia was so deep that local grade school teachers had to sign oaths proving they weren't enemies of the state.
Summary: the complex post-war order. Contradictions of the American dream.
So, looking at these pivotal post-war shifts, the crucial point is that between 1944 and 1952, America really did build a new economic foundation. The GI Bill created the modern middle class. Developments like Levittown revolutionized our geography. And by the time television reached 15 million homes, it had revolutionized our culture. But this prosperity was deeply flawed. It was built under a heavy cloud of racial exclusion in the cities and suburbs, and intense political paranoia enforced by the rise of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. I'll leave you with this thought to analyze on your own time as you close your notebooks for today. Look around your own neighborhoods, look at your media feeds, and look at modern political rhetoric. Ask yourself, how do the physical and psychological blueprints drawn in this post-war era, the suburban divides, the power of a screen to homogenize culture, and the ease with which fear can enforce conformity, how do those architectures of prosperity and paranoia still shape your modern world today? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.